The old deed hit the table like a gunshot. Martha Keene stood in the center of the Caldwell Creek church, her hands trembling so violently that the yellowed paper rattled against her fingertips, and every man in that room stared at her as though she had just confessed to murder. Pastor Elias Holt had his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, his mouth open in a shape that could not decide between outrage and bewilderment. Silas Greer, the man who had just spent the better part of 20 minutes claiming rightful ownership over the 240 acres known as Keene's Hollow, stood rigid beside the altar, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with something she could only call naked hatred. "That is impossible," Silas said, and his voice was so low and controlled that it frightened her more than shouting would have. Martha pressed the deed flat against the wooden pulpit with both palms. Her heartbeat was a hammer inside her chest. "Read it yourself," she said. "Read every word." Pastor Holt leaned forward, dragging the document toward him with one careful finger as though it might bite. The church smelled of pine resin and candle wax and old hymnals, and outside the June wind pushed through the canyon with a sound like distant horses. The pastor read. His lips moved. Then he stopped moving entirely. "Martha Ellen Keene," he said quietly, "sole proprietor." The betrayal in Silas Greer's eyes shifted into something colder, something calculated, and Martha felt it land on her like a shadow. She had lived her entire 26 years in this territory knowing that men like Silas did not simply accept being wrong. They restructured wrong into something that suited them. They buried truth under paperwork, under favors called in, under the kind of force that left no bruises a court would recognize. "That deed is a forgery," Silas said. "It has the county seal from 1871, Martha replied. "Seals can be forged." "Then explain how it turned up in these church records, in your own pastor's own files, in the handwriting of Reverend Beaumont, who has been dead for 11 years. The room was very quiet. The 6 men who had come with Silas Greer as witnesses shifted their boots on the floorboards. Someone coughed. The document did not flinch. Neither did Martha, though every nerve in her body was screaming for her to run. She did not know yet that in 3 days' time, a stranger would ride into Caldwell Creek on a dun-colored horse with a federal surveyor's saddlebag strapped across the back, and that his name would be Isaac Abbott, and that everything about the rest of her life would hinge on what he saw when he walked through the door of this church and found her standing here, alone, with her name on a piece of paper, and no one on God's earth willing to help her defend it. But that moment was still 3 days away. Right now she had only herself. Martha Keene had not been born remarkable. She had been born in the back of a canvas-covered wagon in the autumn of 1857, somewhere between the Missouri River and the Kansas flatlands, while her father Hezekiah Keene drove the team through mud so thick it swallowed the wheels to the axle. Her mother, a quiet and sturdy woman named Frances, had delivered her without complaint, and then gone back to mending a harness strap the following morning. That was the kind of people the Keenes were. They did not stop for difficulty. They absorbed it and kept moving. Hezekiah Keene had arrived in what would become Barrow County, New Mexico Territory, in 1868, when Martha was 11 years old and her brother Thomas was 8. They had traveled with a small party of settlers, most of whom scattered to different parcels of land, once they reached the high desert plateau that the territory maps called promising. Hezekiah had looked at the canyon-cut valley his group called Keene's Hollow and had declared it the finest piece of ground he had ever stood upon. He had filed his deed at the county seat in Agua Dulce, registered it with the territorial government, and had it blessed at the little whitewashed church that Reverend Beaumont had built with the help of a dozen willing settlers. He had built a house. He had dug irrigation trenches. He had planted apple trees that took 7 years to produce anything worth eating, and he had been so proud of them that Martha could still see his face the morning he brought the first real harvest inside, cradling the apples in his shirt like they were made of glass. He had died in the winter of 1879, 11 years after arriving, from a fever that started in his lungs and moved to his blood. He left Martha the land, the house, the apple trees, and no documentation that anyone could find. His original deed, filed at the county seat, had somehow vanished from the territorial records between his death and the spring of 1880. Martha had spent 2 years trying to locate it. What she had not known, until the morning Pastor Holt went through old Reverend Beaumont's personal files while organizing the church archives, was that Beaumont had kept a duplicate of every deed he had ever witnessed being signed. The old Reverend had believed that a man of God should maintain his own record of such things, in case the earthly authorities proved untrustworthy. He had been wiser than anyone gave him credit for. The deed turned up on a Tuesday in June of 1883, pressed flat between the pages of a ledger that had not been opened since the year of Beaumont's death. Pastor Holt sent word to Martha immediately. What he could not have anticipated was that Silas Greer, who had for the past 2 years been quietly building a legal argument for his claim to Keene's Hollow based on the disappearance of Hezekiah's original filing, had a nephew working as the pastor's handyman, and that nephew had read the message before it was delivered. Silas arrived at the church before Martha did. By the time she walked in, he had already begun making his case. The confrontation that Tuesday had ended without resolution. Pastor Holt, a careful and peaceable man, had declared that the deed required examination by proper legal authority before any decision could be made about land ownership. He had locked the document in the church strongbox. He had asked Silas Greer to leave with whatever dignity remained available to him. Silas had left, but not before he turned in the doorway and looked at Martha with those flat, cold eyes and said, "This is not finished." She knew it was not. She drove her wagon back to the hollow in the long evening light, past the scrub oaks and the red rock formations that had marked the edge of her family's land since before she could remember, and she sat on the porch of her father's house and watched the sky turn from orange to purple to black. She thought about what she had and what she did not have. She had the deed, but it was locked in a church in town. She had her name on it, but she had no lawyer, no money to hire one, and no powerful friends in this county. Silas Greer had all 3 of those things, and he also had the peculiar and infuriating advantage that men in positions of power tended to believe other men before they believed women, regardless of what the paper said. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision while her father was dying, and she had not reversed it since. What she needed was someone who knew the law as it applied to territorial land grants. She needed someone with the kind of official standing that would force the county authorities to take the deed seriously. She needed someone who could not be bought by Silas Greer, because Silas had a long reach and a generous hand when it came to the particular kind of generosity that purchased silence. She did not know such a person existed. But she wrote a letter that night to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe by lamplight with her best handwriting, explaining the situation with plain and careful language. She sealed it with wax. She would post it in the morning. It was 3 days later that Isaac Abbott rode into Caldwell Creek. He came from the east, from the direction of the Pecos River country, and he had been riding for 4 days across terrain that would have discouraged most men. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulder, and weathered in the way that men who spent long months outdoors became weathered, not battered but refined, as though the wind and sun had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what was essential. He had dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of good coffee, and he wore a coat that had once been respectable and was now simply honest. Isaac Abbott was a federal land surveyor working under contract with the United States General Land Office. He carried instruments that could measure a boundary line to within inches, and he carried documentation that gave him the authority to conduct official surveys and review land disputes in the New Mexico territory. He had been dispatched from his last assignment near Las Vegas, New Mexico, and he was passing through Caldwell Creek on his way to a survey job further west. He had not been sent by Martha's letter. The letter had not arrived in Santa Fe yet. His presence in Caldwell Creek was, by any ordinary measure, a coincidence. Martha did not believe in coincidences, but she was practical enough to recognize an opportunity when it arrived on a dun horse and tied up at the hitching post outside the general store. She saw him first from across the street. She was coming out of the post office, having just confirmed that her letter had been sent, when the stranger dismounted and stretched his back with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been in the saddle too long. He wore a badge on the inside of his coat, not the outside, which she found interesting. Lawmen who wore their badges on the outside wanted to be seen. Men who kept them inside wanted to be useful. She crossed the street. This was considered bold by the standards of Caldwell Creek in 1883. Women did not typically approach strange men in the street and introduce themselves. Martha had never put much store in the opinion of people who prioritized appearance over practicality. "Excuse me," she said. Isaac Abbott turned and looked at her. His expression was neutral, attentive, the expression of a man accustomed to being approached with requests or problems. "I can see by your saddlebag that you carry surveying equipment," she said. "Are you with the land office?" He studied her for a moment. She was not an inconspicuous woman. She stood straight in a way that had nothing to do with posture lessons, and everything to do with the particular kind of spine that developed in people who had been holding things together alone for a long time. She had brown hair pinned up under a sun-faded bonnet, a practical work dress that had been mended at the hem, and eyes the color of winter sage, a gray-green that shifted with the light. She looked at him directly, which a great many people did not. "Isaac Abbott," he said. "General Land Office." He paused. "You have a problem." "I have a problem," she confirmed. "And if you have time to hear about it before you leave Caldwell Creek, it may be the kind of problem you are equipped to help with." He could have said no. He could have explained that he was passing through, that his schedule was already determined, that personal land disputes were not exactly within his current assignment parameters. He thought about saying all of those things. He said, "I was going to get a meal. You can talk while I eat if you are willing." "I am willing," Martha said. They walked to the Caldwell Creek Hotel dining room, which served as the town's only restaurant, and which smelled permanently of boiled coffee and beef stew. Martha sat across from Isaac Abbott and told him everything with the same plain and careful language she had used in her letter. She told him about her father, about the land, about the disappearing deed, and the 2 years of legal silence and Silas Greer's maneuvering. She told him about the duplicate deed turning up in the church records, about the confrontation 3 days ago, about Pastor Holt locking it in the strongbox. Isaac ate his stew and listened without interrupting. This was unusual in her experience. Most men, when presented with a complicated situation, began formulating their response about a third of the way through the explanation and spent the remainder of the telling waiting for a pause so they could offer it. Isaac Abbott waited until she was fully finished and then sat quiet for another 10 seconds as though he were checking his own comprehension. "The deed is registered in your name alone," he said. "My father placed it in my name when he filed it in 1868. He told me once that he did it because he wasn't sure Thomas would stay, but I was. He was right. Thomas left in 1875 and hasn't come back. And Greer's claim is based on the missing territorial record. He has argued before the county judge that without the territorial filing, the land reverts to open status, and his own filing, which he made after my father's death, takes precedence. The county judge is not inclined to rule against Silas Greer." Isaac put down his fork. Because the county judge's brother-in-law borrowed $1,200 from Silas 3 years ago and has not repaid it." The silence that followed this statement was the kind that meant understanding, not surprise. "The church record is a duplicate," Isaac said. "A true duplicate, signed by the original parties and witnessed by an ordained minister, has legal weight under territorial statute. If the deed itself is authentic, it would stand as secondary documentation of the original filing. Can you verify its authenticity?" He looked at her across the table. She was watching him with that direct gaze that did not plead but also did not pretend. There was nothing manipulative in her face. There was only the clear weight of a real situation being placed before him by a person who needed a real answer. "I can," he said. "I also have the authority to formally document it and submit a report to the land office in Santa Fe that would trigger an official review. The county judge cannot dismiss a federal report." Martha felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted since the moment Pastor Holt handed her that deed. It was not relief, not yet. It was the first small opening in what had been a completely sealed situation. She breathed carefully so that she did not show it too openly. "I would be grateful," she said, "deeply grateful." "I am not promising an outcome," he said immediately. "I can verify and document. What the land office does with it is their process." "I understand." He nodded and picked up his coffee. She noticed that his hands were careful with things: the cup, the documents he had briefly shown her from his saddlebag, the way he had handled the edge of the linen napkin. It was the hands of someone who worked with precision instruments and had developed a general habit of care. "I can stay 2 days," he said. "I will need to examine the deed tomorrow morning and then conduct a boundary survey of the property. If you can arrange access to the church strongbox, we can begin in the morning." "I can arrange it," Martha said. She went back to the hollow that evening with something she had not carried in a very long time. It was the fragile, dangerous thing called hope. The next morning, Isaac Abbott arrived at the Caldwell Creek church at 7 o'clock with his leather surveying case and a set of document examination tools that Martha had never seen before: a magnifying lens, a chemical testing kit in a wooden box, an instrument for measuring ink density, and a set of reference documents from the land office archives that showed examples of authentic territorial filings from the 1860s and early 1870s. He was thorough in a way that was almost hypnotic to watch, methodical and patient, working through each element of the deed with quiet concentration. Pastor Holt watched with his hands clasped behind his back, visibly relieved that someone official was involved. Martha stood near the window and tried not to pace. After an hour and 20 minutes, Isaac set down his magnifying lens. "It is authentic," he said. "The paper stock is consistent with territorial documents from the late 1860s. The ink composition matches the period. The county seal is genuine. The handwriting matches 3 other documents I have in my reference files that were signed by Reverend Beaumont." He looked up at Martha. "This deed is real. Your father filed it legitimately, and your name is the only name on it." Martha pressed her hand briefly against the window frame to steady herself. "Then we do the boundary survey today." "Today," he agreed. They rode out to the hollow together, Martha on her brown mare and Isaac on his dun horse, with a pack mule carrying the surveying equipment. The territory spread around them as they left the town, the red canyon walls warming in the morning sun, the scrub brush and pinon pine casting short shadows across the pale earth. Isaac was quiet as they rode, not uncomfortable quiet, but the quiet of someone who was accustomed to moving through landscapes without feeling the need to fill them with words. It was Martha who spoke first. "Have you been doing this work long?" she asked. 6 years, he said. "Before that I was with the Army Corps of Engineers." "Where were you stationed?" "Various places. Indian Territory, Colorado, Arizona. I requested a transfer to the land office because I was tired of the Corps' tendency to survey land with the assumption that someone else was going to take it from whoever currently lived on it." He said this flatly, without drama, and then seemed to remember he was speaking to a stranger and glanced at her. "I have a view about that kind of work." "So do I," Martha said. Something shifted between them at that moment, small and quiet like a bird settling on a branch. Not a declaration. Just a mutual recognition of having found, unexpectedly, someone who thought a similar kind of thought about a similar kind of thing. The hollow spread out below them when they crested the last rise, and Martha watched Isaac Abbott see it for the first time. It was her habit to watch people see her land for the first time, because what they saw told her something about them. Some people saw the wild grass and the rough terrain and the work that had not yet been done. Some people saw the canyon walls as enclosure. Silas Greer had once looked at Keene's Hollow and told her father it was a pretty piece of nothing. Isaac Abbott looked at it the way her father had looked at it, the way she had always looked at it. He was quiet for a long moment. "Those apple trees are remarkable," he said. "They took 12 years to establish properly," Martha said. "My father started them. I have kept them going. You have been running this property alone for 4 years." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, and then he dismounted and opened his surveying case with the brisk efficiency of a man with work to do. The boundary survey took the full day. Isaac was meticulous, establishing fixed points, measuring distances, recording everything in his field book with the small, precise handwriting of someone who understood that future arguments would be settled or lost by the accuracy of current documentation. Martha rode with him along the boundaries, identifying landmarks, pointing out the stone cairns her father had placed at the corners. At one point in the mid-afternoon, while Isaac was taking a reading with his transit instrument on the north boundary line, Silas Greer appeared on the ridge above them with 2 of his men. They sat on their horses and watched without speaking for a long moment. Isaac turned from his instrument and looked up at them with the calm, measured expression of a man who was not impressed by the effort to intimidate. "Silas Greer," Martha said quietly from beside him. "He will be making note of your federal credentials." "Let him," Isaac said. "The more he understands about what I am documenting here, the more clearly he will see that proceeding against this claim is not in his interest." "He does not always act in his interest," Martha said. "He acts in his pride." Isaac looked at her briefly. "I have known men like that." Silas and his men rode away without a word. But the fact that he had come, that he had found them, told Martha that someone was watching and reporting. The nephew, most likely, or any one of the half-dozen people in town who found it profitable to keep Silas Greer informed. They rode back to the house at the edge of evening, and Martha put the horses in the barn and fed them while Isaac spread his survey notes out on the porch table and began compiling his documentation. She brought him coffee without asking whether he wanted it, because he was obviously the kind of man who ran on coffee when he was working, and he took it with a brief and genuine "thank you." That was not the reflexive politeness of a man performing courtesy, but the actual gratitude of someone who had noticed a kindness. "You can eat supper here," she said, "if you do not mind plain cooking." "I have been eating my own trail cooking for 4 days," he said. "Anything that involves a stove is not going to be plain to me." She made biscuits and salt pork and fried potatoes, which was exactly what the larder allowed for on short notice, and they ate at the kitchen table while the evening light came through the west window and stretched long and golden across the floor. The house was clean and spare, the way a house became when one person maintained it with care and without waste. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, and Isaac glanced at them while he ate. "Cooper," he said. "Dickens. And is that a surveying manual?" "My father's," Martha said. "He believed a person should understand how land was measured. He wanted me to read it." "Did you?" "I did. It is why I knew you were a surveyor from your saddlebag, and not just a traveler with unusual luggage." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same family of expression. "That is unusual," he said. "Most people have no idea what a transit instrument is for." Most people did not grow up with Hezekiah Keene explaining the General Land Ordinance of 1785 over supper, Martha said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," Martha said. The word was landed with the particular weight it always carried, and she let it sit there without hurrying past it. "He would have liked meeting you." The silence that followed was comfortable, which surprised her. She had not shared this table with anyone in 4 years who felt comfortable here. The house had always felt right to her, but it had also felt quiet in a way that had gradually stopped being peaceful and become something lonelier. She noticed now that with Isaac Abbott sitting across from her, the quiet was different. It had room in it. She did not think about that too carefully. He was leaving in one day. After supper, Isaac returned to his notes and Martha washed the dishes and then sat by the fire with a piece of mending she had been putting off, and they existed in the same room in companionable silence for 2 hours until the fire burned low. "You should stay in the barn tonight," Martha said when she heard him gathering his papers. "The ride back to town is dark and the road has a bad stretch near the creek crossing." "I don't want to impose," he said. "You have spent the entire day working to document my land claim," she said. "The barn is clean and there is fresh hay. It is not an imposition. It is simple sense." He studied her for a moment in the firelight, and she had the odd sensation that he was deciding something, though she could not tell what. "Thank you," he said. Simple and direct, the same way he had thanked her for the coffee. She gave him a blanket from the cedar chest and a lantern, and showed him where the barn was, which he could obviously see from the porch. And then she went inside and locked the door, not because she was afraid of him, but because it was the habit of a woman living alone. And she lay in her bed listening to the wind in the canyon and the distant sound of coyotes, and thought about federal land surveyors with careful hands and coffee-colored eyes. She told herself firmly that she was being foolish. He was leaving tomorrow. She was right about both things. She was being foolish, and he was leaving tomorrow. But the tomorrow in question arrived with a development that neither of them had anticipated. In the early hours of the morning before dawn, someone set fire to the eastern fence line. It was a grass fire, moving fast in the dry June air, and Martha smelled it before she heard it. She was up and out the door in the time it took to pull on her boots and grab the water bucket from the kitchen, and she was already running toward the glow when the barn door burst open, and Isaac came out at a dead run with his coat half on, and his hat somehow already on his head. They fought the fire together for 90 minutes. There was a stock tank at the east end of the property, deep enough to haul water from, and they ran the distance between it and the fire line with every container Martha had in her barn, which amounted to 3 buckets and a cast iron pot, while Isaac used his bedroll to beat at the edges of the fire where it tried to spread sideways into the grass. The wind was not cooperating. The fire was not cooperating. But it had not yet reached the apple trees, and Martha was running with a savagery born entirely from the fact that she was not going to let it. Isaac saw what she was running toward and changed his strategy without being asked, focusing his efforts on creating a break between the fire's forward edge and the orchard, stomping and beating at the ground with everything he had. The fire went out as the sky was beginning to gray in the east. Not completely, but enough. The last smoldering edges died in the damp dawn air near the creek, and Martha stood at the edge of the scorched ground with a bucket in her hand and black smudges on her face and arms and let herself breathe. Isaac stood 10 feet away, his coat singed along one sleeve, looking at the burned ground. "Deliberate," he said. It was not a question. "Deliberate," Martha agreed. "The fence line," he said. "Not the house, not the barn, the fence line specifically on the eastern boundary." Martha turned and looked at him. She saw that he had understood exactly what she had understood, that this was not random destruction. This was a targeted message about boundaries, about ownership, about who had the right to mark the edges of this land. "Silas Greer," she said. "I cannot prove it. I know, but we both know." He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, though she had only known him for slightly more than a day. It was the expression he used when he was about to say something direct and slightly uncomfortable. "This escalates the situation," he said. "This is not just a legal dispute anymore. This man is willing to use intimidation and property destruction." "I know that," Martha said. "I am supposed to leave today," he said. "I know that too," she said carefully, holding her voice level. He looked at the burned fence line. He looked at the apple trees, unharmed at the edge of the scorched grass. He looked at Martha Keene, standing straight in the gray dawn light with her hair coming down from its pins and her dress smudged with ash, holding an empty water bucket like a weapon. "I am going to stay until this is resolved," he said. Martha let out a slow breath. The land office will expect you. I will write to them today and explain that I have encountered a federal documentation dispute that requires my official attention." "Which is true," he paused. "It is true, Martha." She noticed distantly that he had used her given name for the first time. She did not point this out. She simply said, "I know it is." They spent the morning assessing the damage, documenting it in Isaac's field book with careful notes and measurements, and then they rode to town together. Isaac sent 3 letters from the post office. One to the General Land Office in Santa Fe explaining the situation and requesting an extension of his assignment. One to the Territorial Marshal's office in Agua Dulce describing the arson in plain legal language. And one directly to the Federal District Court in Santa Fe, filing a formal notice of documentary dispute under territorial land law. These letters, once sent, created a legal record that Silas Greer could not simply make disappear. Martha watched Isaac compose them at the writing table in the hotel lobby, with the same careful precision he brought to everything he did, and she felt the knot in her chest loosen another fraction. They were leaving the post office when they encountered Silas Greer himself on the boardwalk, flanked by 2 of his men as was his custom. Silas was a broad man, not tall but substantial, with a gray-streaked beard and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades outdoors deciding what things were worth. He looked at Isaac Abbott with a measuring eye and did not bother to disguise it. "Mr. Abbott," he said, "I have heard about your activities on Miss Keene's property." "I expect you have," Isaac said pleasantly. "You are a land office surveyor. You are not a territorial lawman. You have no standing to interfere in a private property dispute. The deed in question is a federal filing under the General Land Ordinance," Isaac said in the same pleasant tone. "That makes it a federal matter by definition. My standing is entirely appropriate." He paused. "I have also reported last night's arson to the territorial marshal. I thought you should know that." Something moved behind Silas Greer's eyes. Not quite fear. Something adjacent to it. Something that recognized a situation becoming more complicated than intended. "I don't know anything about any fire," Silas said. "I didn't say you did," Isaac replied. "I said I reported it. Have a good morning, Mr. Greer." He touched the brim of his hat and walked on. Martha walked beside him, keeping her pace even and deliberate, and she did not look back at Silas Greer, though she could feel his gaze on her back like a brand. When they had turned the corner and were out of Silas's line of sight, she exhaled. "You have done that before," she said. "Dealt with men like him." "Frequently," Isaac said. "Intimidation from men like Greer has a specific structure. They rely on the target being isolated and the opposing party having no official recourse. Once you introduce official recourse, the calculus changes." "He will not simply back down," Martha said. "No, but his options narrow considerably." They went back to the hollow. There were fences to repair and the morning's work waiting, and Isaac took off his surveyor's coat and hung it on the porch rail and helped Martha carry fence posts from the barn pile to the burned line without being asked. He was not a man who stood and watched while a woman did physical work. She noted this. She noted a good many things about him over the days that followed, storing them with the careful attention she gave to everything that mattered. He was methodical but not rigid. He was precise but not humorless. He was reserved with words but not with action, and she found that she preferred this combination enormously. He rode a horse with the ease of someone who had grown up around horses but chose not to make a performance of it. He cooked adequately and without complaint when it was his turn. He read at night from whatever book was nearest to hand and didn't feel the need to report his opinions about what he was reading unless she asked. She asked. They talked about books and about the land and about the law as it applied to land, and they talked about what the territory looked like when he had first come through it 7 years ago and what it looked like now, and about what she thought it might look like in another decade. She told him about her father's vision for the hollow, the expanded irrigation, the additional orchards, the possibility of a proper root cellar that would allow her to store enough produce to sell to the markets in Agua Dulce. He listened to these plans with the focused interest of someone who understood that a good plan deserved proper attention, and occasionally he said things that added to the plan in ways that had not occurred to her, quiet additions that came from knowing land and terrain, and what water sources could be extended and how. On the fourth evening, she caught herself watching his hands while he wrote in his field book and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not want him to leave. She had not felt this about anyone. There had been a young man years ago, the son of a neighboring rancher, who had paid her attention for a season and then married the daughter of a more prosperous family. She had been disappointed but not, she realized now, heartbroken. She had not felt about him what she felt about Isaac Abbott after 4 days, and this fact was alarming in its implications. She was a woman alone in a property dispute with a dangerous man. She was not in a position to complicate her life with feelings for someone who would, eventually, go back to his actual work and his actual life. She told herself this with considerable firmness. It did not particularly work. On the 5th day, the territorial marshal arrived. His name was Bill Craddock, and he was a compact, efficient man of 45 who wore his badge on the outside of his coat and had the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for many years. He read Isaac's report, examined the burned fence line, interviewed Martha and Isaac separately and then together, and then rode to Caldwell Creek to speak with Silas Greer. He was back by late afternoon. Greer claims he has 3 men who will swear he was in Caldwell Creek all night the evening of the fire, Marshal Craddock said, sitting on the porch with his hat in his hands. That is 3 alibi witnesses I cannot easily dismiss, even knowing they are bought. He did not need to be present himself, Isaac said. He employs people for that kind of work. I know it, the marshal said, and I cannot prove it from here. He looked at Martha. What I can do is post a notice that this property is under federal documentation review, which creates a legal barrier to anyone attempting to take physical possession or cause further damage. If anything happens to the property or to you while that notice is in effect, it becomes a federal crime. How long can you post such a notice? Martha asked. Until the land office makes its determination. That could be a few weeks or a few months. Months, Martha repeated. Land office processes are not quick, Marshal Craddock said, with the particular sympathy of someone who had watched the bureaucratic machinery frustrate many deserving people. However, Mr. Abbott's report carries significant weight. I have spoken with the district court in Santa Fe before. They take federal land documentation seriously. After the marshal left, riding back toward town with a notice posted on the fence post at the property entrance, Martha sat on the porch steps and looked at the hollow in the long afternoon light. Isaac sat on the step below her, which put his eye level just below hers, and he was looking at the same view. I know this is not settled, she said. Not yet. But it is different than it was a week ago. Substantially different. He paused. You handled this well, Martha. The confrontation in the church, going to the land office, not backing down from Greer. A great many people would have been forced out of a situation like this before it reached the point where help could arrive. She looked at him. He was still looking at the hollow, and his profile in the late light was still, concentrated, the face of a man who was thinking something he had not yet decided to say. Isaac, she said. He turned and looked at her. Why did you stay? She asked. You had grounds to leave, official grounds, legitimate ones. You could have sent the report to Santa Fe and moved on to your next assignment. Why did you stay? The question hung in the warm evening air between them. A hawk turned on a thermal above the canyon rim, that slow, purposeful circle that meant it had found what it was looking for. Isaac Abbott looked at her for a long, honest moment. Because it is the right thing to do, he said. The legal situation warranted it. That is one answer, Martha said carefully. Another pause. The hawk folded its wings and dove. Because I did not want to leave, he said, and his voice was quieter, set differently in his chest. Because I have been doing this work for 6 years, and I have ridden through a great many places, and I have never once stayed anywhere that made me think about staying. And I rode over that rise and looked at this hollow, and I sat across a table from you, and I thought, before I had any reason to think it, that I would not be easy about leaving." Martha absorbed this. "I am not an easy situation to ride into," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are not. I have a disputed land claim and a dangerous enemy and 4 years of accumulated habit of managing entirely alone and a property that demands constant work. I have noticed all of those things," he said, and he looked at her steadily. "And I am still here." She felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time, longer than 4 years, perhaps longer than she could precisely measure. It was frightening. It was also, beneath the fear, profoundly and undeniably good. "I am glad you stayed," she said, simply and honestly. "So am I," he said. They sat together on the porch steps until the stars came out, talking about small things and large ones, and the canyon filled with cricket sound and the distant bell of a goat from the neighboring property 2 miles to the south. And Martha Keene thought that this was perhaps what it felt like when life moved toward something rather than away from it. He did not kiss her that evening. He was careful and respectful in a way that she found, contrary to some part of her expectation, appealing rather than frustrating. He knew what was happening between them as clearly as she did, and he was treating it with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing it, not crowding it. It had the feeling of something being built rather than something being grabbed, and a woman who spent her life building things recognized and valued that distinction. 2 weeks after Isaac Abbott had ridden into Caldwell Creek, a letter arrived from the General Land Office in Santa Fe. Martha read it at the kitchen table with Isaac sitting across from her, watching her face. The letter confirmed receipt of Isaac's documentation report. It confirmed the authenticity finding. It directed the county judge in Barrow County to recognize the duplicate deed as valid secondary documentation of the original filing. It stated that the territorial record discrepancy would be investigated and that any filing made by a third party during the period of record absence would be considered invalid if the original claim could be established. Martha's original claim was established. The letter was signed by the regional director of the General Land Office, and it carried a federal seal that the county judge in Barrow County could not, under any legal interpretation, ignore. Martha set the letter down on the table. Her hands were steady, which she was proud of. Her voice, when she spoke, was entirely steady. "It is over," she said. "The primary dispute is resolved," Isaac said carefully. "Greer may still contest it through the courts." "He can try," Martha said, "but he has now lost the legal argument he was building. He has no case without the missing deed, and the missing deed has been accounted for." Isaac nodded. And then, because he was a precise person and precision required honesty, he said, "You should know that I submitted my formal reassignment request to the land office this morning." Martha looked up from the letter. "I have requested a permanent reassignment to the New Mexico Territory District," he said. "Based in Agua Dulce, which is the district center. It is a 20-mile ride from Caldwell Creek." She studied his face. It was, as ever, composed, but there was something beneath the composure that she had learned to read in the weeks she had spent watching him. He was not indifferent to her response. He was, in his contained and careful way, waiting for it with something very close to vulnerability. 20 miles, she said. "A manageable distance," he said. "For visiting," she said. "Among other purposes," he said, "if the visiting were welcome." She looked at him for a long moment in the kitchen that had been her father's and then hers and had been, for 4 years, a very quiet place, and which had been a different kind of place entirely for the past 2 weeks. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. You are an exceedingly reserved man. I have been told so. So I am going to say directly what I believe you are attempting to say indirectly, because I find that direct speech saves a considerable amount of time and produces better results." She folded her hands on the table. "You want to court me?" Something moved across his face that was, unmistakably, a full smile. It was the first time she had seen that particular expression in its complete form, and it was rather remarkable. The way it changed his whole face, opened it up, made him look younger and also more certain of himself. "Yes," he said. "I want to court you." "Good," she said. "I want to be courted." He laughed. It was a low, warm sound that she was quite sure she would spend the rest of her life being glad to hear. He rode to Agua Dulce 2 days later to arrange his reassignment and settle his affairs in the direction he had been traveling. He was back in 8 days, and he brought with him his official reassignment papers and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that he set on the kitchen table without explanation. Martha opened it after supper. It was a copy of the New Mexico Territorial Land Laws, current edition, annotated in pencil in the margins with what she gradually realized were corrections and additions in Isaac's small, precise handwriting. "So you can read the laws that apply to your land in their most current form," he said, "and so you know I have been thinking about you while I was away." She held the book and looked at him across the table. "This is the most uniquely suited gift I have ever received," she said. "I considered other options," he said, and she could hear that he was very slightly and very carefully being funny, which was a part of him she was just beginning to discover. Flowers seemed insufficient given the circumstances. A surveying instrument seemed excessive. "A law book," she said. "A law book," he confirmed. She set it beside the other books on the shelf, next to her father's surveying manual, and they fit together naturally on the shelf the way things did when they belonged in the same place. The summer moved forward with the particular richness that comes after a long period of difficulty. Isaac rode out from Agua Dulce every week or so, sometimes for a few days, and his visits fell into a rhythm with the work of the property and the life of the hollow. He helped with the fence repairs that the fire had necessitated. He helped Martha assess the irrigation channels and drew up a plan for extending the main channel to reach the new section of land she wanted to bring under cultivation the following spring. He was not a man who confused helping with taking over, and Martha found this distinction deeply important. On a Sunday in August, he drove her to church in the wagon, which in Caldwell Creek was a statement of public intention that everyone understood. Pastor Holt married couples in this church. He also observed who arrived together on Sunday mornings, with the careful attention of a man who considered himself spiritually responsible for the congregation's romantic arrangements. He said nothing, but he shook Isaac's hand with considerably more warmth than usual when they filed out after the service. Silas Greer was not in church that Sunday. He had, in the weeks since the land office letter, been notably absent from Martha's proximity. The territorial marshal had followed up on the arson investigation, and while no charges had yet been filed against Greer specifically, the investigation remained officially open, which meant that any further action against Martha's property would occur under circumstances of heightened scrutiny. This appeared to have had a tempering effect on Silas Greer's appetite for confrontation. Martha did not consider herself safe. She was realistic. Men like Silas did not simply accept defeat, but she also recognized that his power over her situation had been substantially reduced, and she intended to use the breathing room this created to make the hollow strong enough that challenging it would no longer seem worth the cost. One evening in September, sitting on the porch in the cooling air with the last of the summer's warmth still in the canyon walls, Isaac said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," Martha said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was ordering his thoughts carefully. "I have been living out of 2 saddlebags and various boarding houses for 6 years, he said. "I have a salary from the federal government and almost no expenses because I am never anywhere long enough to accrue them. I have savings that I have done nothing useful with." He paused. "I have been thinking about what useful would look like." Martha kept her eyes on the canyon rim and her voice very even. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "I have reached the conclusion that I would like to invest in this property," he said. "The irrigation expansion, the additional orchard, the root cellar you have been planning, these are sound investments in productive land." "As a business arrangement," Martha said carefully, Another pause, longer this time. "No," he said. "Not as a business arrangement. As a man who intends to make his life here, if the woman who owns this land is willing to consider a future that includes him in it." Martha turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the same direct honesty he brought to his survey measurements, precise and without evasion. His coffee-colored eyes held something she recognized now because she had been watching for it and seeing it grow over the months, something that was steadier and more permanent than any temporary feeling. It was the look of a man who had found where he wanted to be and was asking, with every restraint he possessed, if he was allowed to stay. "Isaac Abbott," she said. "Martha Keene," he said, in the same tone, a mirror of hers. "Are you asking me to marry you? I am doing my best to ask you to marry me while also conveying that I understand it is your land and your life and your decision, and that my wanting this does not override your right to think carefully about it." She considered him for a moment. She thought about her father, who had always said that the measure of a man was not what he claimed to be, but what he proved to be through his actions, when actions were what was needed. She thought about the months since June, about the careful hands and the thorough documentation and the burned fence line, and the letter to Santa Fe, and the annotated law book on her shelf, and the Sunday mornings at church, and the easy silences, and the genuine conversations, and the way he listened when she spoke, as though what she said was worth the full attention of a careful mind. She thought about the fact that she was 26 years old and had lived alone for 4 years, and had never once met anyone who felt like they belonged in this hollow the way her father had, the way she did, until Isaac. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, carefully. The way he handled things he found valuable, and she felt the warmth of it all the way to her bones. They married in November of 1883. Pastor Holt performed the ceremony in the same church where the deed had been found, on a clear cold morning with thin winter sunlight coming through the plain glass windows. Martha wore her mother's dress, altered at the sleeves and let out slightly at the waist, and she carried a small bunch of dried lavender that one of the neighboring ranchers' wives had saved from her summer garden. Isaac wore his good coat, brushed clean, with a new shirt that he had purchased in Agua Dulce. There were perhaps 30 people in the church. Some were neighbors from the surrounding ranches. Some were people from town who had watched the property dispute with a sympathy they had been too cautious to express openly, while Silas Greer's influence was at its peak. A few were people who had known Hezekiah Keene and who came, Martha suspected, partly to witness his daughter's happiness and partly to honor a man who had built something good in this hollow. Silas Greer was not among them. Martha had not expected him to be. Pastor Holt pronounced them husband and wife. Isaac kissed her with the same carefulness that characterized everything he did, and then she felt him let go of that carefulness just slightly, and the kiss became something that made the people in the pews produce the involuntary sentimental sounds that people in pews produce at weddings, and Martha could feel herself smiling even in the middle of it. They drove back to the hollow together in the wagon, and the afternoon was cold and clear, and the apple trees stood bare-branched against the winter sky, waiting for spring. Martha looked at them as they passed and thought of her father planting them, and thought that he would have approved enormously of this day. They went inside and built up the fire and ate the wedding supper that the neighboring wives had provided, a remarkable spread of preserved food and baked goods that covered the kitchen table and spilled onto the sideboard. They ate too much and talked and laughed and sat by the fire in the long winter evening, and it was the finest evening Martha Keene, now Martha Abbott, had spent in that house. She told Isaac this. "Martha Abbott," he said, as though trying the name. "I will be keeping Keene as well," she said. "Professionally speaking, the land is in that name." "Of course," he said without hesitation. "Martha Keene Abbott," he smiled. "It suits you." They were happy that winter in the way that people are happy when they have come through difficulty together, and found on the other side something they did not know they were missing, with a depth that easier happiness never quite achieves. The hollow was quiet in the cold months, the work scaled back to maintenance and planning, and they had time to learn each other in the small daily ways that matter most, the coffee habits and the sleeping habits and the preferences about which side of the fire to sit on, and who was better at listening to problems, and who was better at solving them, though these turned out to be more similar than either had expected. Isaac took on survey work in the surrounding territory through the winter, riding out for days at a time, and Martha managed the property with the same competent steadiness she had always brought to it. When he came back, she found that the house felt different when he was in it, fuller and warmer in a way that had nothing to do with the fire in the grate, and she suspected he felt the same thing because he always came through the door with a quality of relief about him that he never tried to hide. Silas Greer made one final attempt in February of 1884. He filed a petition with the territorial court in Santa Fe, challenging the validity of the land office's ruling on technical grounds related to the chain of custody of the duplicate deed. It was a sophisticated legal argument, the product of a good lawyer and a significant retainer. Isaac spent 3 days preparing a counterfiling that documented every step of the church record discovery, the authentication process, the marshal's investigation, and the land office's review. He was meticulous and thorough, and absolutely without mercy in his attention to every factual detail. The counterfiling was 47 pages long. The territorial court dismissed Greer's petition in March. When the dismissal notice arrived, Martha read it twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at her husband. "It is finished," she said. "It is finished," he agreed. She stood up and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her for a long time in the morning light with the smell of coffee and wood smoke around them, and the dismissal notice sitting flat on the table with its official seal and its absolute finality. And Martha let herself feel the full weight of what she had been carrying, and then, carefully and deliberately, put it down. Keene's hollow was hers. It had always been hers. Now it was also theirs. Spring came with the particular violence that spring brought to Canyon country, sudden and bright, with fierce afternoon thunderstorms that drove the water table up and turned the hollow's grasses green overnight. Martha expanded the irrigation channel in April with Isaac's help, and the help of a young man from town named Diego Ruiz who wanted to learn survey work, and proved to be a fast learner with a good head for precise measurement. Isaac took him on informally as an assistant, which freed Isaac from some of the more routine parts of his federal work, and also gave Diego a future that the town of Caldwell Creek had not been offering him. The apple trees bloomed in late April with an extravagance that Martha had not seen since her father was alive. She stood in the orchard one morning and looked at the white blossoms against the blue sky and thought about how things that were nearly lost sometimes came back stronger than before. Isaac came up behind her and stood with his hand on the small of her back, looking at the same blossoms. He did not say anything because the moment did not need words. In the autumn of 1884, Martha knew she was expecting a child. She told Isaac on a Tuesday evening after supper, directly and plainly, which was her way. He sat very still for a moment in the way he sat still when something large had just landed in his comprehension, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and knelt down beside her chair and took her hands and looked up at her with an expression she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. He was not a man who cried easily or often, but his eyes were bright. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Perfectly well," she said. "Strong and well. Stop looking as though I am made of porcelain." He laughed a little shakily, and stood up, and she stood up, and they held each other in the kitchen in the way they had held each other the morning the dismissal letter arrived, with that same deep and grounded quality. "A child," he said into her hair. "A child," she confirmed. "In the spring." The boy was born in March of 1885, on a cold, bright morning with the apple trees just beginning to show the first pink white of their buds. He arrived with considerable noise and determination, which Martha felt was appropriate for a child born in this hollow. She lay in the bed her father had built and held her son, and Isaac sat beside her on the edge of the bed with his big, careful hand resting on the baby's back, and the room was full of the particular sacred silence that follows a birth. "Hezekiah," Martha said. "I would like to call him Hezekiah." Isaac looked at her and then at the baby. "Hezekiah Abbott," he said. "It is a serious name for a very small person." "He will grow into it," Martha said. "My father did." "Then Hezekiah it is," Isaac said. He was smiling. They called him Ezra within 6 months because Hezekiah was long and the baby was vigorous and quick, and Ezra seemed to suit him better in daily use. Martha approved of this adaptation. Her father would have found it practical. Ezra grew with the apple trees, it seemed. The way things in the hollow had a habit of doing everything in concert. He was a healthy and curious boy who had his father's methodical nature and his mother's direct gaze, and who showed, by the time he was 3, a passionate interest in the surveying instruments that lived in a leather case in the study. Isaac allowed him to hold the transit rod with both hands, very carefully, and the expression on the child's face was one of such concentrated seriousness that Martha had to leave the room to laugh without discouraging him. Pastor Holt, who had presided over so much of their history, baptized Ezra and then, 2 years later, baptized their second child, a daughter they named Frances after Martha's mother. Frances was born in the summer of 1887, in the heat of a July afternoon, and she arrived in a considerably more efficient manner than her brother had, as though she had assessed the situation and determined that excessive delay was not warranted. Martha looked at Frances in the same afternoon light, with Isaac beside her and Ezra peering around the doorframe with wide eyes at this new and startling development in the household, and she thought about how completely different her life looked from the woman who had stood alone in a church in June of 1883 with a piece of paper in her hands and no one willing to help her. She was not that woman anymore. She was a more complete version of herself. She was Martha Keene Abbott, owner of Keene's Hollow, wife of Isaac Abbott, mother of Ezra and Frances, and she had built this life the way her father had built the apple orchard, patiently, with good judgment about what to plant and where, and with the understanding that the best things took time. The Hollow continued to grow in those years. The new orchard section that Martha had planned finally came into full production by 1888. Doubling their apple yield and making Keene's Hollow apples a recognized commodity at the markets in Agua Dulce, and eventually, as far as Santa Fe. They hired 2 permanent workers, brothers named Carlos and Roberto Sandoval, who proved to be exceptional farmhands with deep knowledge of the local terrain and water patterns. Isaac learned from them and they learned from him, and the 3 of them redesigned the irrigation system in the summer of 1889 in a collaboration that was one of the most practically satisfying projects Martha had witnessed. Diego Ruiz, who had apprenticed under Isaac in the spring of 1884, had by 1889 become a licensed territorial surveyor in his own right. He came to the Hollow one autumn afternoon to show Isaac his official credential with a pride that was entirely undisguised and entirely earned, and Isaac shook his hand and told him he had always known he would achieve this, which was the truth, and Diego produced a bottle of rye whiskey from his saddlebag, and they all sat on the porch, and the men had a drink and Martha had coffee, and they watched the canyon turn golden in the late light. This was the texture of life in the Hollow. Not dramatic, mostly. Occasionally dramatic, but mostly the rich and textured ordinary, the kind of day-to-day that sounds simple when described, and is, when you are living it well, the finest thing available to human beings. Isaac was promoted within the General Land Office in 1890, given a senior survey position that extended his official territory and increased his responsibilities considerably. He could have taken a position that required him to relocate to Santa Fe. He declined it. He counterproposed a restructuring of his role that allowed him to manage the expanded territory from Agua Dulce, arguing that a field surveyor operated more effectively when he had deep local knowledge, which was demonstrably true, and which the land office director, who had worked with Isaac long enough to know his results, accepted without extended argument. Martha heard about this negotiation after the fact. She had not known he was declining the Santa Fe position. "You did not tell me you were considering it," she said. "I was not considering it," he said. "I was considering how to decline it in a way that preserved my standing." "Isaac," she said, "if you had wanted to go to Santa Fe—" "I did not want to go to Santa Fe," he said. "I want to be here. I have always wanted to be here. The question was never what I wanted. The question was how to keep the work I value while remaining in the place I value more." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man she had known for 7 years and been married to for 6, who was still, in the essential ways that mattered, the same careful and honest person who had ridden into Caldwell Creek on a dun horse and looked at her land like he recognized it. "You are not always easy to know," she said. "You are quiet about the important things." "I know," he said. "You are not quiet about anything which balances it." "I am direct," she said with dignity. "You are magnificently direct," he agreed, and the warmth in his voice when he said it made the word direct sound like something precious. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers the way he had always held things he found valuable. Ezra, who was 6, and at an age when he appeared silently in doorways and observed adult conversations with the wide-eyed attention of a small naturalist studying unfamiliar specimens, appeared in the kitchen doorway at this moment and looked at his parents holding hands across the table. "Are you being sentimental?" he asked, with the tone of someone requesting clarification on a practical matter. "Enormously," Martha said. Ezra considered this information and then disappeared back down the hall. They heard him telling Francis, in the serious voice of a brother conveying important news to a younger sibling, that the parents were being sentimental again. Martha and Isaac looked at each other, and both of them were laughing in the way that you laugh when a moment is so exactly right that laughter is the only available response. Silas Greer died in the winter of 1891, of a heart condition that had apparently been troubling him for some years. Martha heard the news in town and sat with it for a day before she could identify precisely what she felt about it. It was not triumph. It was something more complex than that, something that acknowledged that Silas had been a real person with a real life even while he had been an opponent, and at times, a genuine threat. She thought about the missing deed, the deliberate erasure of her father's filing from the territorial records, and she felt a clean and final anger about it that then simply passed. He was gone. The threat he had represented was gone. The hollow was hers and Isaac's and Ezra's and Francis's, as clearly and legally as any property in the territory, and no one was going to challenge it again. She said a brief, honest prayer for the man, because she had been raised to pray for people regardless of how she felt about them, and then she went home and made supper and told Isaac, who was quiet about it in his way, and they did not speak of Silas Greer again after that. In the spring of 1892, the apple trees bloomed more beautifully than Martha had ever seen. She walked through the orchard on the April morning when the blossoms opened, with Francis beside her collecting fallen petals in her apron with the focused industriousness of a 7-year-old engaged in important work, and Ezra ahead of them both, already at the far end of the orchard where Isaac was showing him how to take a measurement reading with the compass. Martha stopped in the middle of the orchard and looked at it all. The blossoms, her daughter, her son with her husband at the far end, both of them bent over the compass with their heads close together, in a way that was so similar in posture it made her chest ache, with something she could only call surfeit of love. The canyon walls red and gold in the morning light, the irrigation channels full and running with the spring melt, the smell of apple blossom and warm earth and water, This was her father's land, and it was her land, and it was her family's land, and it would grow forward from here with all of them written into it. Ezra would know every inch of this hollow. Frances would know it. There would be grandchildren someday who would know it, and the apple trees her father had planted would still be bearing fruit when none of them were present to see it, because the best things outlasted the people who planted them. Martha Keene Abbott stood in her orchard in the April morning and let the fullness of her life settle around her, complete and real and hard one and very, very good. Isaac looked up from the compass at the far end of the orchard and saw her standing there, and even from that distance, she could see the expression on his face that she had come to know as intimately as her own heartbeat, the quiet, settled joy of a man who knew exactly where he was and was grateful beyond his ability to say it for being there. He raised one hand in a small gesture that was not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement. Just the particular signal between two people who have been long enough together that they can speak across a distance without words. She raised her hand back. Frances tugged at her skirt. "Mama, my apron is full." "Come inside then," Martha said. "We will put them in a bowl on the table." "Will they stay beautiful?" Frances asked. "For a little while," Martha said. "That is enough." They walked back through the orchard together, her daughter's hand in hers, the apple blossoms falling white and soft around them, and behind her she could hear Isaac's voice, patient and precise, explaining to Ezra the relationship between a compass reading and true north, the way that you established where you were by understanding the fixed points around you, and how, once you knew where you were, you could move forward in any direction with confidence. Martha thought that this was perhaps the finest lesson she knew. And she thought, as she came out of the orchard into the sunlight of the yard, that Keene's Hollow had become exactly what her father had believed it could be, which was not simply land, not simply a property marked on a survey map with a name on a deed, but a place where something real had taken root and grown, slowly and with great effort and through considerable difficulty, into something that could stand against any wind the territory threw at it. The deed was still in the church strongbox in Caldwell Creek. Pastor Holt had decided, with the approval of all parties, to keep it there as part of the permanent church archive. A duplicate of the duplicate, properly notarized and filed with the county, sat in the strongbox at the Keene's Hollow house, alongside Isaac's land office documentation and the territorial court dismissal, and every other piece of paper that constituted the legal history of their lives here. But the original, with its county seal from 1871, and Reverend Beaumont's steady handwriting and the single name, Martha Ellen Keene, standing alone at the top of the ownership line because her father had believed in her and had put that belief down in legal ink, that document stayed in the church. Martha thought it was right that it should. It belonged somewhere permanent. It had waited long enough in a dusty ledger to be found. It deserved to rest in a place of dignity. She had her life. She had her husband and her children and her land and her apple trees and the long evenings on the porch and the winter mornings by the fire and the particular irreplaceable texture of days lived in a place you love with people you love more than the place. She had, in the end, everything her name on that paper had once only promised. And the hollow held them all, the way it had always held the light, the way the canyon walls held the sound of wind, completely and without reservation, as though it had been made for exactly this purpose and had been waiting, with the patient certainty of deep earth, for exactly these people to arrive.